All right, good morning, everybody. Just a few quick notes before we get started. Again, today, Wednesday, 12 o'clock over at the ARF. There's going to be another brown bag lecture, so those are open to you. I wanted to also let you know that I'm going to be posting, I'm sorry I haven't posted the PDFs. I've fallen a little bit behind in posting the PDFs for lecture, but those are going to be up by hopefully the end of the day. And I'm also going to be posting a review sheet, similar to the one that you guys got for the midterm. I know we're putting a whole bunch of names up on the board. Again, the point being we want you to see the complexity, especially this period that we're talking about now, the late Bronze Age, where we've got the names of these contemporary kings, these kings who would interact with one another, as we're going to talk about in a moment. That said, I don't want you to get swamped with, just the sheer amount of data that we're throwing at you. So that review sheet ought to give you, again, a sense of, the key points we're looking at. Not comprehensive, but should clarify things a little bit. All right, so with that said, I wanted to pick up where we left off last time. We were talking about, oops, come on. We were talking about Assyria, and the rise of Assyria, and how under the reign of these Assyrian kings, including starting with Ashur-uballit, ending up, where did we stop? We ended up with Tukulti-Ninurta. We were looking at this altar of Tukulti-Ninurta, and this Nemdu throne of Nusku, right? Nusku, which again is a god linked to writing, a god rendered again in this way, in this very stylistic form, right? Not a seated deity as we've come to expect, but this almost icon of either a writing implement or maybe an implement used for weighing out, apportioning things, a scale, if you will. Not quite clear, but we do see this during the reign of Tukulti-Ninurta and during the Assyrian Empire, this distancing that's taking place between people and the gods. I just wanted to go back to this quickly because I forgot to mention, in addition to the self-referential aspects of this piece, just like we've seen with the Uruk vase, a number of other items, of course, here's the altar itself, referencing itself and its use. There's also narrative composition with this piece as well. We see Tukulti-Ninurta himself, in addition to the texts which describe, right, what this was used for. If you remember last time, it actually says, this altar is meant to perpetuate and constantly pray for Tukulti-Ninurta. We see Tukulti-Ninurta himself 2 times over, standing before the altar and then kneeling down before it in this progression, this almost narrative scene. Again, we know it's not 2 different people because if you look, again, everything about them is completely identical. Everything from the depiction of the hairstyle, the jewelry, the clothing, and most importantly, again, this scepter. And the scepter that Tukulti-Ninurta is holding, and particularly this gesture he's making, are very iconic Assyrian gestures and it's Assyrian iconography that will be important as we get into the Iron Age a couple weeks from now, and we start looking at the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which eventually picks up the reins at the collapse, the late Bronze Age. But we'll get to that. You'll see the parallels when we reach that point. But again, it's a very interesting piece that describes how it's supposed to be used in text, but also plays out again in image. It's just a very, very clear and interesting piece. So Tukulti-Ninurta 2 times over. We talked about some of the other altars. Again, this one of 3 altars, another one of the 3 altars from the Ishtar temple. The link here again being all of this Assyrian conquest, the conquest of foreign lands. And while this scene is very difficult to make out, again, we see chariots, we see individuals climbing over mountains, moving into new territories, which parallels the expansion of the Assyrian Empire as it starts to take over Mitanni around 1350 or so. We looked at this container from Ashur, which again sort of expresses the same ideas. We compare these motifs with earlier Assyrian reliefs, such as this one from Shemshi-Adad, of individuals being stepped on, enemies of the state being dispatched, and chariotry moving forward. I want to talk a little bit about Tukulti-Ninurta himself. Again, we were talking about these Assyrian kings, and among them, Tukulti-Ninurta was not a particularly popular guy, both abroad and at home. This is the same Tukulti-Ninurta who took advantage of instability in Babylon and ended up sacking the temple of Marduk, bringing back the statue of the god to Ashur. And this never goes down well. Sacking temples, even if they're in enemy territory, is just a big no-no. And later on, we know Tukulti-Ninurta was actually killed by his own son and his own palace courtiers. But because of this unpopularity, because of some of the things that he was trying to do in Assyria at the time, Tukulti-Ninurta does what any good usurper or anyone trying to change the status quo in an empire will do. He founds a new city. And so he founds the city named after himself, Kar Tukulti-Ninurta. This is a bit down to the south. It's still in the Assyrian heartland. You can see it's very close to Ashur. It's pretty much just across the river. Let's take a look at this site. And in it, we see a number of parallels that sort of stretch back in time. This is a new capital city, but at the same time, right, at Tukulti-Ninurta, we see wonderful frescoes and paintings that echo perhaps what we saw earlier on, right? The wall paintings at Nuzi, for example. The same sorts of floral and vegetal motifs, the same use of geometry and patterning, which really echoes the Mitanni past of this area. So we've got an Assyrian king stepping in, founding a new capital, but like we've seen before, drawing on prior motifs, prior traditions, and appropriating them for his own use. At Kar Tukulti-Ninurta, we also see an emphasis on glass making. This is a fragment of a glass mosaic from Ashur at the time of Tukulti-Ninurta. And of course, right, glass, like we saw at Tel Brak and Nuzi, was very important, this development that happened under the Mitanni. Yeah?
Does the bowl mean anything? Is the same one that's like in kind of
The bowl up here?
The wall thing?
Yeah, right. So we talked a little bit about these guys before, right? These are the ones from Nuzi. And this was Nuzi sort of appropriating Egyptian iconography, right? This was like the goddess Hathor. But bowls are really interesting because we see them early on at Catalhoyuk, and then we see them, as a sort of symbol of power. In Egypt, they kind of become associated with the king. We see them in places like Cyprus, actually, where bulls are sacrificed and the horns are cut off and put into temples. So bulls are used throughout this period as symbols of power. Often they're venerated. The Apis bull in Egypt was actually a bull that would sort of embody the god in the New Kingdom. And we're going to get to Egypt in a moment, but in this case, yeah, they're drawing on a similar set of iconography, and in this case, right, it's very Egyptian what they're trying to do here. Does that make sense? And so yeah, we looked at some of those parallels with the Hathor stuff, and we'll look actually at Deir al-Bahari in Egypt in a moment. Tukulti-Ninurta, the city itself, is very interesting for a number of reasons. It's a commercial center, again, outside of Ashur, and we look at those painted walls. The architecture, again, is drawing on earlier Mesopotamian traditions, in the sense that there's a ziggurat. There is a ziggurat built at Kar Tukulti-Ninurta dedicated to Ashur. It's fairly large. It's about 90 square feet. Unfortunately, only the base of it is preserved. You can see, again, the state of things today. But interestingly, unlike the great ziggurat at the Temple of Ur, which was essentially a platform with a temple on top of it, we see at Kar Tukulti-Ninurta the temple sitting outside of the platform itself. We would have had a ziggurat, but then the temple and all of the cult statue, for example, is inset into the ziggurat slightly, but all of the action is really taking place in front of the temple. Also, unlike the temple, the ziggurat at Ur, We don't have any evidence of stairs leading up to this platform. It's possible that in the upper levels of this temple it would have been accessed from the roof, but again, we don't have that level of preservation. This goes very hand in hand with, with other things we've seen in terms of the architecture at Ashur. We looked at some of those new types of temples, twin temples dedicated to twin gods. So again, this is a period of experimentation, both in politics and also in art and architecture. Some more of those parallels. This is a cult stele from Ashur itself, from the Old Assyrian, possibly the Middle Assyrian period. And again, we see a lot of the same iconography that we've come to expect. For example, goats, right, our flanking goats here, everything we've seen since the late Uruk period, ram in the thicket. We have also, right, these small goddesses with their vases and flowing water motif. So as much as this new Assyrian, what will become an Assyrian empire, as new as it is, it's still, again, picking up the trappings of the past and establishing itself as one of these kingdoms. In those letters, right, that we saw last time as well, as Ashur-uballit especially starts writing to these great kings and saying, hey, listen, I'm a king of the same stature as you. You are my brother, and here, take these gifts. So the Assyrians, after 1350, really begin to establish themselves with the fall of Mitanni. I'm just going to close this. All right, so we'll keep talking about the Assyrians, but I really wanted to move on to Egypt today. Slideshow. Here we go. Okay. And again, we've seen that the relationship between Egypt and Mesopotamia is a very long history of interaction, as early as 3100 BCE, both in art and in architecture. However, it's during the late Bronze Age, again, this period from 1600 to 1200, that we see the first documented contact between Assyria and Babylonia and Egypt. Previously, they'd only made contact through the Canaanite cities in the Levant, right? The cities of modern Jordan, Israel, and Syria. This area would remain a key crossroads, except now the Levant is characterized by increasing Egyptian military and political domination. So we're gonna rewind a little bit, just like we have with the Hittites, with the Assyrians. We're gonna go back to 1600 and see how this process develops. And Egypt really gives us a chance to do this in depth because of the extent of actual textual records in addition to archaeological material culture. In the beginning of the Late Bronze Age, the Late Bronze Age coincides with the reunification of Egypt under Ahmose around 1550 BCE. Handsome guy, as you can see. Prior to this, at the end of the Middle Bronze Age, Egypt had been occupied by a Canaanite population, right? The Middle Kingdom fell, and Egypt was occupied in the north by a dynasty known as the Hyksos. The Hyksos had a capital in a city of Avaris in the Egyptian Delta at a site called Tel el-Daba. And it's Ahmose who is able to reunify Egypt and drive them out. He drives them out across the Sinai Peninsula here and back into the southern Levant. This happens around 1540, and in doing so, Ahmose founds the 18th dynasty of Egypt. And with the 18th dynasty, this is really the beginning of what we call the New Kingdom. And the New Kingdom of Egypt is really where we'll see these classic kings and monuments that we associate with Egypt today, or at least many of them. Some years later, Ahmose takes the fight to the Hyksos. He marches across Sinai and lays siege to their capital at Sharuhen, which really foreshadows how Egyptian foreign policy is going to play out in the